King Salman, the guy at the top of the triangle here. Salman just turned 80 this Christmas season. He had been, for the last 50 years before he became crown prince in 2013, the governor of Riyadh. Riyadh is the Saudi capital. It's right in the middle of Saudi Arabia in the Nejd Desert. When Salman became governor back in the 1960s, Riyadh was a town of about 200,000 people. Today, it is a mega city of over 7 million people. And Salman presaged over this remarkable growth in the city of Riyadh. And he did it in a way that modernized the city, brought it up to international standards in airports, highways, hospitals, educational institutions, but always kept the Al-Sheikh family and the Wahhabi part of the kingdom happy. He understood the balance between modernization and maintaining Saudi Arabia's unique form of Islam. Being governor of Riyadh also meant something else. Almost 90% of the House of Saud lives somewhere in the Riyadh area. The House of Saud is not a tiny little family like the Windsors or the Hashemites or the Pahlavis before them. There are somewhere around 10,000 princes in Saudi Arabia, and accordingly an equal number of princesses. But almost all of them live in the Riyadh area. And as governor of Riyadh, Salman knew them all, and he knew them when they were young princes and young princesses, and he knew everything that was in their closet. In other words, he was the enforcer in the House of Saud. And if you'd had some transgression when you were 12 years old, Prince Salman, now King Salman, knew what it was. And he literally had a prison in Riyadh for those prince and princesses who might have fallen from grace and needed to be re-educated. In addition to this, he was also the financier of Saudi Arabia's own jihads. We all know that in the 1980s, anyone who's seen Charlie Wilson's War will remember, the CIA and the Saudi intelligence service jointly funded the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. That was official money. Prince Salman was given responsibility for raising private money from the believers in the kingdom. And in fact, for the first 5 years of the war, Prince Salman raised more money privately than the CIA and the Saudi intelligence service donated together from their coffers. He went on to do the same thing for Bosnian Muslims, and he's always done it for the Palestinian movement. The king, therefore, today is a true believer, not just in the faith, but in the notion that Saudi Arabia has a unique responsibility to support holy warriors. Mohammed bin Nayef, now crown prince, he's been crown prince now for almost a year, is about 55 years old. He's extraordinarily well prepared for the job. He went to school at Lewis and Clark College in Oregon. He then went into the business of becoming the next Minister of Interior in Saudi Arabia, where he would succeed his father. He was trained at the FBI Academy in Quantico, and then went on to Scotland Yard. I have called him the Prince of Counterterrorism, because he really is the Prince of Counterterrorism. Mohammed bin Nayef may be the best counter-terrorist in the world today. He has successfully defeated Al-Qaeda in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He was responsible almost single-handedly for preventing the last major Al-Qaeda attack on the homeland of the United States back in 2013. His spies were able to figure out that Al-Qaeda was going to send bombs to explode over November of 2012, on the eve of the 2012 election. outside Barack Obama's own hometown. His spies were able to give the Central Intelligence Agency the tracking numbers of the cartons the bombs were being sent FedEx to the United States. Now, if someone gives you the tracking numbers of bombs and you fail to prevent them from getting on those planes, you really ought to get out of the counterterrorism business completely. Because if someone gives you the tracking number and you screw it up after that, you're really in the wrong business. This is actionable intelligence. Mohammed bin Nayef is so good at his job that Al-Qaeda has tried to assassinate him at least 3 times. The most famous time was this man over here. He was a senior Al-Qaeda operative. He volunteered to turn himself in, and he said that not only will I turn myself in, but I will bring other senior Al-Qaeda operatives in from Yemen. But I'll only do it if I can do it face-to-face with Mohammed bin Nayef. Mohammed bin Nayef agreed, and he also agreed that he would not be searched except by a regular metal search like you get at the airport. It turned out that the terrorist who wanted to turn himself in was actually fibbing. He was still a terrorist. And in what I will refer to as a body cavity, and I'll leave it at that, he had a bomb on him. When he met with Mohammed bin Nayef, he asked if he could use his cell phone to contact his friends in Yemen. When he got his friends in Yemen on the phone, he gave it to Mohammed bin Nayef, and they said, "Welcome to hell." And the terrorist blew himself up. Fortunately, because his body cavity was low to the ground, most of the force of the blast went straight up, meaning there's not much left of him, but nothing really happened to Mohammed bin Nayef. The new number 3 is Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Nayef is referred to in the kingdom as MBN. Mohammed bin Salman is referred to as MBS. I'm sorry, all the names start the same way. It's either Mohammed or Abdullah. That's the way it is in Saudi Arabia. But remember, Mohammed bin Nayef is number 2. Mohammed bin Salman is number 3. Mohammed bin Salman is probably 30. Why do I say probably 30? Well, when his father acceded to the throne in January of 2015, he became Minister of Defense, which had been one of Salman's last responsibilities when he was also Crown Prince. And the Saudi press in January 2015 led readers to believe that the new Minister of Defense was 34 years old. Even 34 seemed remarkably young in a kingdom which prides itself on expertise, in which age is venerated, in which experience counts a lot. Then, in April, as I said, he came, in addition to Minister of Defense, Deputy Crown Prince. And now the Saudi press led you to believe he was 30. The New York Times, prompted by someone in the think tank community, searched hard at King Saud University, and no one could remember him being in that class. Turned out he wasn't in that class. He was actually 29 years old. Why do I dwell on this? Because obviously it's a point of friction for Mohammed bin Salman exactly how old he is. But let's say for now he looks to be somewhere around 30. He has older siblings. There are other sons of King Salman who have much more experience. One of them was the first Saudi astronaut. Another has been Deputy Minister of Petroleum for more than 20 years. But Mohammed bin Salman is clearly the king's favorite. He is widely regarded as a bull in a china shop. He's aggressive. He's obviously very, very earnest about getting ahead. Not only that, but Saudi Arabia provides enormous amounts of money to its various allies in the Muslim world. Egypt, Pakistan, Jordan, Bahrain, Djibouti, Sudan, all get healthy payoffs from the kingdom. How longer can they continue to sustain that? That's challenge number one. Challenge number two is, of course, the post-Arab Spring. Saudi Arabia escaped the Arab Spring. There was no revolution in Saudi Arabia. Could it have? King Abdullah thought it could. As soon as the Arab Spring broke out in 2011, King Abdullah returned from a vacation in Morocco and immediately ordered the government to spend $120 billion basically buying off the Saudi people. If you wanted a new Datsun, if you wanted a new Mercedes, if you wanted to send your kids to school, if your village needed a new hospital, there was money galore. But of course, you can only do that for so long. Since the Arab Spring, Saudi Arabia has become the head of the counter-revolution in the Arab world. Its own troops occupied the island of Bahrain in March 2011 to prevent a revolution there. But the post-Arab Spring chaos continues. There's turmoil everywhere. Yemen, Iraq, it's all around the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And a third challenge, of course, flows from Saudi Arabia's rivalry with Iran. Let me take you back to Mr. Wahhab for a moment. Mr. Wahhab believes in the oneness of God, that you should only worship God. You shouldn't even worship Muhammad, the prophet, and certainly not worship Mr. Wahhab. Well, what do Shias believe? Shias believe that not only is the prophet Muhammad worthy of veneration, but his nephew Ali is worthy of veneration. In other words, for Shias, there's a hierarchy of veneration. They are the party of Ali. That's what Shia means, the party of Ali. You can see that by birth, Saudi Arabia's birth kind of Islam is going to be at war with Shiism. Add to that Arab-Persian rivalry, add to that rivalry for control of the Persian Gulf, add to that rivalry for control of the entire Middle East, and Saudi Arabia have been in an intensifying war of words and now hot wars. Throughout the Middle East, you can find Saudi Arabia on one side of a civil war and Iran on the other. Even in Yemen, the Saudis argue that the Iranians are supporting the rebels. Conflict between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam goes back to the 7th century. But in my experience, it has never been as bitter and fierce as it is today. Saudi Arabia thus confines itself in a situation which could be the perfect storm. Combination of economic problems, a region in tatters, socio-political change at home, and quarrels over succession, the Achilles heel of every absolute monarchy. For the first time, I think, really in our lifetimes, certainly since the 1950s, there is a serious possibility of revolutionary and radical change in Saudi Arabia. But I caution you, don't count out the House of Saud. They've been around since 1744, after all. And when the oil wealth began to surge into the Middle East in the early 1970s, there were 3 states in the Persian Gulf with dramatically different political systems. Imperial Iran, with its modernizing Shah, who wanted to make Iran into Sweden in 10 years. Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which allowed women equality. Yes, it was equality in a police state, but they had every reason to be as persecuted as any man in a revolutionary nationalist, socialist system, and Saudi Arabia. Very few observers, I think, back in 1973 or 1974 would have said only one of those would survive into the 21st century.
Okay, so here's the deal. There's a bunch of questions that have to do with various aspects of asking you to comment on Saudi policy toward the Syrian refugees. And anything from basically, have they accepted any? If not, why? Are they financing the flow of refugees? I mean, if you basically can talk a little about that.
They have accepted some, not very many. I think there are several reasons for that. First reason is not very many Syrian refugees want to go to Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
I don't need to say a lot more than that. You know, Syria is, I don't want to portray the Assad government as anything other than the brutal killers they are, but the Assad government did allow women equality, gender equality existed in Syria under the Assads. You could also get a drink in Syria pretty easily. There was no laws against alcohol. If you're a Syrian refugee and you start looking around, where do you want to go? I think Saudi Arabia doesn't automatically rank as your top choice. Jordan, Turkey, among Arab and Muslim countries are obviously more likely to be places where Syrians, especially Syrian women, are going to feel comfortable. And of course, Germany is the real pole of attraction. The Saudis have provided a lot of money for Syrian refugees, particularly in Jordan, but also in Turkey.
So we have a bunch of questions that have to do with different aspects of Saudi military. And they range from sort of questions about your assessment of Saudi's defensive capabilities to a question of how, you've touched on part of it, how anxious they are to project that military power. There's also a question related to, could you sort of give the audience a sense of Saudi's relative military power compared to others in the region? And finally, the biggie. Saudi Arabia want to get a nuclear weapon.
Okay.
Okay.
There's a lot of questions there.
Well, but this is how good he is. Jim was wrong, by the way. There's no question that Bruce can't answer, so not to worry.
And there's another question which, if I forget, we should bring up, which is the whole question of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia spends more per capita on its military than almost any country in the world. If it's not number one, it's number 2 or 3. Saudi Arabia is, the NATO norm that the United States encourages NATO countries to spend is about 2% of GDP. Saudi Arabia spends well over 10% of GDP on weapons. As a consequence, it has quite a large military. Its Air Force is equipped with state-of-the-art British and American F-15s, Tornados, Typhoons. Its Air Force has, in the last year, engaged in a serious air campaign in Yemen with a lot of collateral damage, but nonetheless a very serious air campaign. It's also engaged to a lesser extent in the air campaign against the Islamic State. Most Saudi Arabia's Air Force is heading south towards Yemen rather than north towards Syria and Iraq, and that's a point of some friction with the Obama administration. It is far from a perfect air campaign, but it has demonstrated a certain degree of competence. The Saudi army, on the other hand, has about 200,000 men under arms. The Saudis seem to be remarkably unwilling to send it into combat. They defend Saudi space against the Yemeni rebels, but Saudi Arabia has sent maybe a total of 2,000 troops into Yemen itself. Do they want a nuclear weapon? I think that any country in a situation like Saudi Arabia, surrounded by turmoil, surrounded by enemies, surrounded in a region by a lot of other countries that either have nuclear weapons or have sought nuclear weapons, would want nuclear weapons. Think for a minute if you were the national security advisor of Saudi Arabia. Immediately to the north is Iraq. Now, Iraq's weapons of mass destruction were destroyed long before George W. Bush's war, but they did try to acquire nuclear weapons back in the 1980s. That's a fact. Will they try to acquire them again sometime in the future? Probably. Iran, we've just signed an important deal, a deal which I think probably prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon for more than a decade. But what happens after that? Pakistan, another country in Saudi Arabia's immediate environments, has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world. And then there's Israel, which has nuclear weapons, even if the Israelis won't admit it. And the kingdom and Israel, while they may have overlapping interests in a few cases, are still fundamentally enemies. And then, of course, there's Russia not far away, there's India, and of course, there's the United States of America. They're surrounded by people with nuclear weapons. If I can persuade you for a minute to pretend you are the national security advisor of Saudi Arabia, wouldn't you think we should have nuclear weapons too? Problem is, Saudi Arabia doesn't have any of the infrastructure. It has none of the scientists, none of the physics capability to produce nuclear weapons. But it does have a relationship with Pakistan, the fastest growing nuclear power in the world. And since the mid-1980s, if not earlier, there have been persistent rumors that there's some kind of a secret deal between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which goes like this. If Saudi Arabia ever really needs the bomb, good friend Pakistan will deliver the bomb in its moment of crisis. I've talked to Saudis about this, including some very senior Saudi officials, and they grudgingly say, yes, you're right.
How good, though, would the intelligence services of the West be in detecting such a breach?
Well, let me give you an example. In the mid-1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq and Iran, as you remember, as you know well, engaged in the war of cities, firing missiles at each other. In the mid-1980s, Israel bombed the Iraqi nuclear facility, and it carried out a bunch of other long-range military operations to Tunis, to Baghdad, and to other places. The Saudis decided that they needed to get a missile system. And they secretly negotiated with Communist China, with which at the time they had no diplomatic relations. And they and the Communist Chinese agreed that Communist China would provide Saudi Arabia with an intermediate range ballistic missile. It's called the East Wind in China, or the CSS-2. They successfully not only purchased them, but imported them secretly into the kingdom, built the underground nuclear launch facilities underground missile launch facilities that they would fire from, and installed them before Western intelligence, including the CIA, including the Mossad, including MI6, found out about them. When we came to the conclusion, I think in 1986, that the Saudis had successfully pulled off one of the great arms diversions in history, in a country where we thought we had things pretty well covered, people were mad as hell in the Reagan administration. One other thing to know about a CSS-2. In Communist China, they never put TNT on a CSS-2. There's no point in putting it. It's like hurling a block of concrete 1,000 miles through the sky. Yes, it'll make a big bound, big hole in the ground, but that's all it will do. In Communist China, it has a nuclear weapon. So if you're among those who think there may be something between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, they have the launch facilities to do it. Last point on this. A year and a half ago, for the first time since the 1980s, Saudi Arabia publicly displayed its CSS-2s. They had never shown them to the public before. 2 years ago, in a military parade, the CSS-2s were paraded along with the tanks and everything else. Who was sitting in the stands as the guest of honor for the parade? The Chief of Army Staff of Pakistan, the most powerful Pakistani general in the world. Was that a signal? Well, I can tell you, my phone was ringing off the hook with Saudis saying, "Did you see who was there? Do you get it? Do you understand?" I'm slow, but I figured that one out.
Yeah. Actually, this is an interesting segue into a couple of other questions. So if I imagine that scene that is seen all over the place, right? Everybody knows that, and probably Israel sees that just as well as you did, and their phones are ringing off the hook as well. So, a couple of people have wanted to ask about the potential relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, appreciating obvious difficulties between them, but appreciating maybe that they both hate Iran as much, but now again, if you put into play this issue of potential nuclear and Israel's demand, really, for nuclear monopoly.
Right.
How does that complicate any potential, however under the table it might be, of Saudi and Israeli discussions?
First thing I would say is that fundamentally, Saudi Arabia and Israel have an enormous difference. The Saudis are believers in the Palestinian cause. I mentioned FDR and Ibn Saud, and an argument, should it be in Palestine or Bavaria? That argument has gone on ever since then. Saudi Arabia has been a very generous supporter of Palestinian movements over the years. As the custodian of the two holy mosques, Saudi kings also feel a responsibility for the third holy mosque in Jerusalem. And if you study Saudi Arabia's reaction to peace proposals over the years, for the Saudis, the fundamental question has always been, will the Dome of the Rock come back under Muslim Arab sovereignty? They're prepared to see parts of Jerusalem move into Israel, but Saudi Arabia's fundamental position, and here it gets to the core of the alliance between the Saudis and the al-Sheikh family, is that Jerusalem must return to Muslim rule.
Israeli convergence with regard to Iran. Could you share with us sort of the Saudi policy narrative that they were saying about why would it be better for them to not have that agreement on Iran? What were they gained by that?
The Saudis were less interested in the nuclear physics part of the deal than in the sanctions part of the deal.
Yeah.
From the Saudi perspective, the sanctions regime was the best thing that could possibly happen. The whole world agreed that Iran was the bad boy, who was the pariah, and would be under sanctions. And essentially what the Saudis wanted to have is, let's keep that forever. Never let them go. Keep them under sanctions forever. Don't let them export oil. Make it hard for them to sell oil. Not only does that weaken our enemy Iran, but, by the way, helps us a lot on the on the oil market as well. For the Saudis, it was all about the sanctions, keeping the sanctions in place. And for them, that's what's wrong with the deal. But of course, realistically, you were never going to get the deal without the lifting of the sanctions. Saudi Arabia is smart enough to recognize that. So what do you end up getting? You get a lot of this grumbling under their breath. Oh, this is a really bad deal. This is a really bad deal. But the truth of it is, they're smart enough to know the deal is now a done deal, and they're going to have to live with it. What they worry about is, what does Iran do with all that money that it now is able to get because sanctions are no longer in place? How much of that money goes to the rebels in Yemen? How much of it goes to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Force? How much of it goes to Iran's conventional military capabilities? How much does it go to Shia extremists within the kingdom? About 10% of Saudis are Shias. They've been repressed since 1744. They will continue to be repressed. They are an easy recruiting ground for the Iranians. The Saudis know that. Nobody knows that better than Mohammed bin Nayef. But they have to live with the consequences of the deal. And you don't see as much grumbling in Saudi Arabia today about the consequences of the deal as you do in Israel. The Saudis have moved on. They've come to grips with its a fait accompli.
We have a cluster of questions that take us back into Saudi Arabia and its internal mechanisms and so forth. So it's actually you've touched on one part of it, but it's a four-part question that I'm going to give you, okay? He's very good. So you mentioned, so these are sort of concerns and threats. Three of them are, and then a different category, to the Saudi body politic. One you've mentioned briefly, and that is the Shia minority. And the question is that simply managed by brutality only or some other possible way? The other thing you've mentioned is this growing different aspirations of young Saudi women who are educated and maybe have different expectations than their mother did. What avenues are there for them? The third one actually is young Saudi men. They're certainly privileged relative to the women, but their job options aren't that great either. And so you've got essentially this generational time bomb, and I imagine, I'll just add this part in, but if we look at the Shia problem, there's got to be a generational issue there as well. So those are the threats. And then the other question that I'll throw in here is that someone asked is, are there any, or what would you say are the constraints that a Saudi king must attend to, if any?
Let me start with the Shia. They're roughly 10% of, nobody does census data in Saudi Arabia that is publicly available, so we don't really know how many there are. Ironically, the vast majority of those Saudi Shias are all located in what is called the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, the part that's right on the Persian Gulf, which means that the Shia are actually sitting on the place where all the oil is. So if you want to think about the paradoxes here, the Lord Almighty decided to put all the oil in the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but he put it under the Shias' villages. What was the complicated message he was sending to all of us by doing that?
Probably not oneness.
Probably not oneness. It is primarily repression that holds them in place. King Abdullah, again, a reformist by Saudi standards, did try to improve the standard of living in the eastern province, did try to encourage Shia participation in the workforce and in lower levels of the government. Most of that fell apart when the Arab Spring happened. King Abdullah also advanced as king what he called a dialogue of religions. He brought together Saudi clerics and other Sunni clerics from Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, with Christian, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Shintos. He never invited any Shias to these dialogues. But there were Sunnis who were kind of semi-Shias who were invited. But he never held one of these dialogues in Saudi Arabia. These dialogues of religions were held in places like Madrid, Barcelona, Vienna, and that gets to your last question, constraints. The king of Saudi Arabia knew it was a good idea to have inter-religious dialogue. He just never felt that he could actually do that in the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So the biggest constraint, I would say, is this fundamental alliance between the Wahhabi clerical establishment and the royal family. In that sense, Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy and a theocracy. And that's unique in the world. An absolute monarchy that has to be careful that it doesn't get in the way of the theocracy that is its equal partner in running the country.
Okay, so there are quite a few questions have come in, and I'm going to consolidate them. The issue basically is the religious extremism of Saudi Arabia, and you've talked a little bit about oneness and the importance of the kingdom and the religion and so forth. But there's people would like you to talk about, in a sense, the funding and the exporting and support of extremists in many places via madras and so forth, and how important is that to Saudi Arabia internally, the effects that it has. Are there any ways to put the brakes on that or change that?
It's a very important question, and a question about which there's a lot of hyperbole out there. As I said, the Saudi religion is not Al-Qaedism, but there is a relationship between the kind of worldview that the distinctive brand of Islam that Saudi Arabia promotes has, that is susceptible to being warped into Al-Qaedism. Remember, though, at the same time, as I said, Saudi Arabia is at war with Al-Qaeda. It's a real, genuine, serious war, and it's at war with the Islamic State. And Mohammed bin Nayef is one of the best warriors in that battle. So it's a complicated question. The Saudis were basically in denial about this problem until 2003, when Al-Qaeda started blowing things up in the kingdom. Up until then, the Saudi view was, this is an American problem. It's a Canadian problem, it's a European, but it's not our problem. It would never happen here. When it started to happen there, things began to change. It is more difficult now for a rich Saudi to send money to a clearly terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda. One of the things Mohammed bin Nayef has done is made it harder for pious Muslim Saudis to end up supporting extremist causes like Al-Qaeda. But you're going to run into question marks. What about the Syrian opposition, much of which is Sunni Muslim, some of which is at war with Al-Qaeda and war with the Islamic State, and getting money, not only from pious Saudi Muslims, but getting money from the Saudi government?